Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Daily Bolt with your host, Dr. Jeff Tilley. You'll notice that there isn't a thunderclap in today's introduction because I'm in my car and something is weird going on between getting the thunderclap effect to work and the phone. So, regardless, it's the Daily Bolt with Dr. Jeff Tilley, and today's topic, uncertainty principles, social media toxicity, and Dogbert. Sit back and relax, and welcome to this edition of the Daily Bolt. So, some of you who have followed the Daily Bolt via my Facebook pages may or may not have seen that for a while I had a couple of comments related to a previous podcast number 60 in particular, where I'm talking about the importance of teaching theory as theory and not as fact. And I started getting comments from a gentleman, I believe he's of German descent, but I don't know that for a fact, has a German name, and I could tell right away that there was a possibility that this gentleman was more or less what you might call a social media troll. And I was concerned because I'd never met this individual before. He'd never commented. He wasn't somebody that I knew in the science community. And he had no real credentials other than the fact that he also produces a science-related podcast, despite the fact that he has no science degrees. His science education is probably very limited. He may be self-taught. He may be just taught by what he reads on the internet, which is extremely dangerous, as I have talked about before in previous podcasts. So I was a little bit wary of this gentleman, and I tried to be polite. I was even more suspicious given the nature of his comments were such that he took various things I said out of context. He appeared to read into my statements what he wanted to hear, particularly with regard to the subject of evolution and the subject of climate change. And I tried responding and tried to remain polite and neutral and professional. And basically mentioned to him, okay, no, you're not understanding this. This is what I was saying, blah, 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 blah. And then he sort of got to a point where he wasn't sure how to respond, so then he starts questioning me. He said, well, I want to put you on my podcast. I want to refer to it, and just answer me these two questions, which were two very explosive questions about creationism versus evolution, and about the human caused proportion of climate change. And I told him politely that I didn't want to address those on Facebook. I was going to address them in a future podcast. In fact, I probably will address them in a future podcast. And immediately after that, he started getting rather hostile with me. I got a comment from my sister on text and phone call that basically said, boy, what happened with this guy? He was so rude, he was so nasty, etc., etc. And I got to the point where once he started getting into the name calling, as I've said before on this podcast, I welcome comments, I welcome discussion. Once you start getting into name calling on my Facebook page or anywhere else, then I start taking steps to get rid of you, because I don't put up with name calling in terms of a manner of discourse, even though it has become commonplace in social media. This is the social media toxicity in terms of the title of this podcast. So you're probably wondering how this relates to uncertainty principles and to Dogbert. Well, first of all, a lot of the way that I approach subjects like creationism and climate change, and frankly, virtually every other scientific subject, is to recognize the fact that there is uncertainty. Uncertainty in measurements, uncertainty in our theories, uncertainty in our understanding, and uncertainty even in the observations that we have that we've tried to base theories upon. So there's all these uncertainties that exist. And these uncertainties are different in a sense than the classical uncertainty principle, which comes from quantum mechanics, which basically says that you can't know with the same precision the position and momentum of a quantum state of matter. Basically, you're talking about the subatomic level. And nonetheless, it still is. It applies to virtually every other scientific concept, that there is some sort of uncertainty. I won't go into the quantum mechanics right now. I'm just going to use that as a fact that this is what I approach my podcasts with in terms of my approach to science as a scientist, as a person who's been a practicing scientist for over 3 decades, as opposed to this gentleman who was a photographer, according to his Facebook page. And he only had 1 or 2 pictures on his page, which made me really suspicious as to whether he was even a photographer. In fact, his main picture is of a dog that has clearly a reflection of a flash in its eyes, and it just looks kind of creepy, and that's the only picture that he shows. So is he even a photographer? He probably isn't even a photographer. I don't know. He certainly didn't list scientific credentials. I don't know. When I get to someone who I can debate scientifically, it can get, fairly intense. But with most of the listeners on this podcast being non-scientists, I try and keep it general, and I try and keep everything as objective as possible, and keeping in mind the fact that from a science point, we do have uncertainties. Social media does not like uncertainty. That is very clear. Not just in this gentleman's response to my podcast, but all over the place, on Facebook and Instagram, every other social media outlet that you can possibly think of. People talk in black and white. This is wrong, without even knowing the context. This is always wrong. It's certainly wrong. And it may be wrong, but it also may be a function of how you look at it. What's the context? What's the background? And social media, because it's so easy to type so quickly, and we have so many keyboard warriors out there, tends to attract people who deal in absolutes and with absolutely no intent on doing anything but screaming at you and telling you they're wrong, because somehow this makes them feel better about themselves, that they're right. I don't know. But it also brings about now the third piece of the title of this podcast, Dogbert. How does Dogbert fit into this? Now, for those of you who don't know, Dogbert is a character in Scott Adams' comic strip, Dilbert, which has been around for quite some time. It started well over 20 years ago, dealing with absurdities in corporate America, especially in terms of engineering and high-tech engineering firms within the marketplace. And Dilbert is the main character. Dogbert is his dog. Dogbert wears glasses, Dogbert talks, and is generally considered to be the smartest character in the strip, the most ruthless character in the strip, and the one who basically fits the best within social media contexts. Dogbert will tell you that he thinks you're wrong. He does not care what your reasoning is. He does not care anything about what you have to say. He's just going to say it, and he's going to say it loud. And in fact, there was a actual Dilbert strip in which Dogbert went around screaming at people saying, "I am loud. You must obey me because I am loud," and screaming at you. And he intimidated everybody else in the strip and got what he wanted. And this is exactly what we see on social media and social media toxicity. So I guess I have been initiated into this. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I do know that it's not going to stop me from doing podcasts. It's been a few days since I've been able to record this one, but we're going to be picking up the pace again over the next couple of weeks. And I just thought I would address this, given that some people saw that the comments were there and then they disappeared. Well, they disappeared in accordance with my policy that I've stated earlier in this podcast, that I'm happy to have discussion, I'm happy to have debate, I'm happy to agree to disagree. Once you start name-calling, then I start deleting. I am all for civil discussion. I am not for Dogberts. I am not for screaming. I am not for people who do not want to listen to another point of view. That is not science, actually. Science is all about varying points of view and trying to learn and discover in a collaborative or even in something of a competitive sense the truth. That's what my podcasts will always be about. So on that note, I'm going to close this Daily Bolt out. I'm Dr. Jeff Tilley. I hope you have a good afternoon, a good morning, a good night whenever you're listening to this, and God bless.